The lights of Lakewood Church in Houston glowed like stars fallen from the heavens, casting golden halos across the largest congregation in America. On this night, however, it wasn't just the grandeur of stained glass and polished marble that held the audience's breath. It was a man, young, military, unflinching, stepping into the spotlight not to preach comfort, but to stir conscience. For the first time in the history, a sitting African head of state, Ibrahim Traore, president of Burkina Faso, had come face to face with Joel Osteen, America's smiling prince of prosperity. It was a moment no one had planned for, and no one would forget. He did not come with a choir. He did not come with a smile. He came with a question, one that would shake not just the stage, but the soul of the global church. If Christ came to your city today, would he even recognize his church? Stay with us. This is no ordinary conversation. It's a challenge to the soul of faith itself. Subscribe to Africa Rising Voice and be part of the awakening. They said it would be a night of unity, a celebration of faith, cross-cultural dialogue, and inspiration. That was what the banners said. That was what the TV promos promised. But when the moment arrived, when Ibrahim Traore stepped onto the polished stage of Lakewood Church, the air itself seemed to change. The grand auditorium, known for hosting some of the most uplifting sermons in the Western world, fell into a silence thick with anticipation. Joel Osteen had already welcomed him with his signature smile. He introduced the young African president as a man of courage, a man of change. The audience, polite as always, responded with a mix of claps and cautious glances. For many seated that night, Traore was just another African politician, charismatic, military-clad, and entirely foreign. But within minutes, that perception would collapse. When he stood, he did not wave. He did not thank the crowd for their applause. He did not smile at the cameras. He simply began, "I thank you, but I have not come here to entertain. I have not come here to flatter. I have come to speak truth, even if truth is uncomfortable." From that first sentence, the tone of the evening changed. This wasn't going to be a feel-good dialogue. This wasn't a meeting of equals exchanging pleasant remarks. Traore had come with fire, and in a space built to house comfort, his truth was going to burn. He began with Africa, with Burkina Faso, with the people who had suffered hunger, war, and colonization, but who still carried their faith like a torch in the dark. And then he turned the lens, not inward, but outward. Too often, he said, religion has been twisted into chains rather than wings. The gospel is not a product. Salvation is not for sale. A ripple moved through the pews. Some nodded quietly. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Joel, ever the gracious host, tried to steer the moment gently, offering, "That's why we're here, to hear your truth." But Traore wasn't here to negotiate. He wasn't here to soften his words. His voice grew firmer, his gaze sharper. Jesus Christ did not suffer on the cross so that his name could be used to build mansions and empires. Christianity is not about motivational speeches. It is not about comfort. It is about sacrifice, and the audience murmured. Some applauded, others gasped. The camera lights blinked faster now, capturing every reaction. And Joel, who had built a ministry on joy, positivity, and hope, began to show signs of tension. He tried to redirect the conversation. "We believe in lifting people up," he said gently. "There's nothing wrong with positivity." Traore turned and looked at him directly. "Hope without truth is deception. Positivity without accountability is poison." And then came the question that cut through the room like a thunderclap. When was the last time you spoke about justice? When was the last time you condemned the corruption of the powerful? A man in the front row let out a low whistle. A woman near the back whispered, "Lord, have mercy." The room no longer felt like a church. It felt like a courtroom. Traore continued. He spoke about African pastors arriving in poor villages with cameras and promises, only to leave with the people's money and souls still bound. He spoke of mega churches with golden altars while children sleep hungry at their doors. He spoke of faith that had become a theater. "This is not the Christianity Christ died for," he declared. "This is a marketplace built in his name." Social media began to erupt. Hashtags exploded across the internet. Clips of the moment, Traore Speaks, Joel Challenge, Christianity Truth began to trend within minutes. People around the world tuned in not just to watch, but to witness. Joel tried again. Churches do a lot of good. We feed the poor. We bring people together. But Traore wouldn't let it go. And yet the poor remain poor, and yet injustice thrives. Tell me, Joel, how often have you looked into the eyes of the powerful and told them to change? The room grew still again. He quoted scripture, not with the polished cadence of a televangelist, but with the urgency of a prophet. The love of money is the root of all evil. His words weren't just directed at Osteen, they were for everyone. For every preacher who flies private while preaching humility. For every congregation that passes the offering plate a second time while ignoring the widow in the last row. For every believer who has traded sacrifice for slogans. Traore's voice rose, not in volume, but in conviction. Christianity is not about building bigger churches. It is about building stronger hearts. It is not about promising wealth. It is about preparing for struggle. It was a sermon that none had expected, and few were prepared to receive. But it was only just beginning. What he said next would silence the world's most influential pastor. 1,000 eyes watched, yet none dared blink. The hall of Lakewood Church, once vibrant with claps and cameras, now seemed suspended in time, caught between reverence and revelation. Ibrahim Traore stood unmoved. His words had already pierced through the polished decor, through the stage lights, and into the hidden places of conscience. But now the storm would reach its peak. His eyes locked again onto Joel Osteen, who had spent the past minutes trying, gently, awkwardly, to defend his ministry. We believe in spreading hope, Joel had said. We believe in lifting people up. His voice, though calm, carried the tremor of someone trying to hold on to familiar ground as the spiritual earth beneath him shifted. Traore did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. Hope without truth is deception. Positivity without accountability is poison, he repeated slowly. Then came the moment that would echo across continents. Tell me, Joel, when was the last time you spoke about justice? When was the last time you condemned the corruption of the powerful? It was not a rhetorical question. It was a challenge. The crowd gasped, visibly shaken. A woman in the second row dropped her Bible. A man whispered to his wife, "Did he just say that to Joel?" Osteen blinked. He opened his mouth, but no words came. For a moment, it was as if the most articulate man in American Christianity had forgotten how to speak. The audience leaned forward. Twitter exploded. Live comments on YouTube surged past 100,000 in seconds. A hashtag emerged instantly, Comment Traves Joel. Traore kept going, unflinching. You preach to millions. You preach to people who are broken, who are hungry, who are desperate. And instead of giving them the fire of truth, you give them cotton candy, sweet words, empty promises. Another wave of reactions moved through the crowd. Some applauded loudly. Others shouted back in protest. One woman stood and cried out, "Preach, brother," while another muttered, "That's disrespectful." But Traore wasn't debating. He was testifying. Christianity was never built on comfort, he declared. It was built on blood, sweat, and tears. The early followers of Christ were persecuted because they stood for something greater than themselves. Today, the church stands for comfort, for popularity, for applause. Joel tried again to regain the floor. I believe in God's goodness, he said slowly. People need encouragement, not condemnation. That's what I try to bring. But Traore was relentless, though still composed. Encouragement without truth, he answered, is like medicine without the cure. It numbs the pain, but it never heals the disease. The hall murmured again. There was no going back now. The line had been crossed. Then Traore began to walk. His military boots echoed against the polished floor, a sharp contrast to the soft carpet of most preachers. His voice lowered, but burned even deeper. In Africa, we know suffering. We know hunger. We know what it means to cry out for God with an empty stomach. And I have seen too many men arrive in our villages, preachers with polished shoes and expensive cameras, who leave with our money, but not our chains. His face turned toward the audience now, not just the pastor beside him. If Christianity is to mean anything in this century, it must return to truth. It must return to justice. It must return to sacrifice. Otherwise, it is nothing more than theater. The audience split, audibly, visibly. Some stood up and clapped, others booed. Joel raised a hand, perhaps to calm the crowd, perhaps to protect his platform. But Traore wasn't done. Christianity is not about bigger churches, he repeated. It is about braver hearts. Not about filling seats, but about filling souls with courage. Not about promising wealth, but preparing people for struggle. This time, even some of the church staff were shifting in place. Ushers glanced at each other. A producer gestured nervously to the control room, but the cameras stayed rolling. And then came the most devastating line of the night. If Christ himself walked into this church today, he would not be sitting in the front row. He would be out in the streets, standing with the poor, the broken, and the forgotten. The applause erupted, not from everyone, but from enough to shake the hall. Joel stood now, clearly rattled. "Mr. President," he began, "surely we can agree that God is love, and love is what we must share." Traore turned toward him again, quietly but firmly. "Yes, Joel, God is love, but love is not silence. Love is not avoidance. Love does not look away from injustice. True love demands truth. True love demands sacrifice. True love demands courage." For the first time, Joel Osteen sat down not as a pastor in control of a conversation, but as a man sitting under the weight of a higher conviction. His famous smile had all but vanished. Across the globe, reactions were flooding in. In Nigeria, pastors debated the meaning of theater Christianity. In South Africa, youth leaders played clips of Traore's words in Bible studies. In London, headlines read, "President Traore confronts the megachurch gospel." In Atlanta, one black pastor tweeted, "This was the rebuke we've been praying for." This wasn't just a moment in one church. It had become a turning point, a wake-up call to millions. And as Traore paused to breathe, the audience still reeling, one thing was clear. This was no longer a debate about theology. It was a war for the soul of the gospel. The confrontation wasn't over. Traore had just begun to reveal the deeper wound. In the days that followed the broadcast, echoes of Ibrahim Traore's confrontation with Joel Osteen traveled far beyond the marble walls of Lakewood Church. This wasn't just a viral moment, it was a reckoning, not only for televangelism, but for how faith intersects with power, poverty, and politics across continents. In Burkina Faso, reactions weren't measured in claps or social media hashtags. They were written on the faces of farmers, teachers, and mothers. In a small village outside Ouagadougou, an elder named Mamadou listened to the replay of Traore's words on a neighbor's radio. His eyes welled with tears, not of sadness, but of relief. "He said what we could never say," Mamadou whispered. "He spoke for us." This wasn't just about religion. It was about how religion had been used, manipulated, monetized, and exported. For years, communities in Burkina Faso had watched slick-tongued preachers arrive with TV crews and luxury vehicles. They preached healing but charged fees for prayer. They filmed worship but left no clean water behind. And the people, devout and desperate, had given over and over again, hoping their loyalty would one day turn into miracle. Traore had seen it all, and now the world had seen him speak it. "Preachers fly private jets," he had said, "while children starve. Churches build monuments of gold, while the poor sleep outside their doors." For many in Burkina Faso, those words weren't radical. They were reality. And yet this bold confrontation now had ripples. Not just spiritually, but socially and politically. In city halls across the region, local leaders began to field questions from citizens. If our president can speak truth in America, why can't our pastors speak it here? In churches from Bobo Dioulasso to Fadangorma, sermons shifted, some subtly, some dramatically. One young preacher in the north opened his next Sunday message with Traore's exact words, "Encouragement without truth is like medicine without the cure." The spiritual reformation was beginning to carry political weight. In many ways, Traore had been building toward this moment. As a military leader turned statesman, he had long called for Pan-African dignity, But his criticism of Western religious economics was new and bold. He wasn't simply confronting pastors. He was exposing a spiritual colonialism that had outlasted the political one. And people were listening. The social consequences were immediate. Donations to foreign-based ministries dropped in certain regions. Community-organized worship began replacing satellite-fed church broadcasts. Christian-Muslim cooperation projects, previously marginal, started receiving attention. But there were deeper layers still. Traore had drawn a line between prosperity preaching and political complacency. He had asked the question that Western churches rarely ask themselves. How many times have you stood before your government and demanded justice for the oppressed? And this wasn't theoretical. In Burkina Faso, a nation long plagued by economic imbalance and extremist threats, churches were often the only stable institutions in some regions. If those institutions could be reclaimed, freed from imported ideologies, they could become engines of real empowerment. In one rural town, a school principal shared how, for years, Christian missions had offered scholarships, but only to those who attended a particular denomination. They helped, he admitted, but they divided us first. After Traore's speech, that same school announced a new partnership between Christians and Muslims to build a shared library and host interfaith literacy classes. Traore had lit a flame, not just in pulpits, but in policy. Yet not all responses were hopeful. Some political actors, especially those with ties to foreign NGOs, began to view Traore's rhetoric as dangerous. One international columnist even warned that the president was blurring the line between faith and revolution. But for many in Africa, that line had already been blurred, long before Traore ever took the stage. The deeper truth was this: religion in Africa had always been political. Under colonialism, it was used to pacify. Under globalization, it became a product. Now under Traore, it was becoming a battlefield, one where identity, dignity, and justice were at stake. But the most powerful effects were happening quietly. A young woman in Burkina Faso's south, who had once considered leaving her faith after witnessing corruption in a local ministry, posted on Facebook, "Today I believe again, because someone told the truth in front of the world." In this moment, Traore was no longer just a president. He had become a voice, a prophetic voice, speaking not just to the state of religion, but to the condition of society. And that voice had hit a nerve not just in churches, but in the hearts of a generation hungry for integrity. If you believe faith must return to sacrifice, say amen in the comments. And still, the question lingered: what are we building in God's name? In America, where the confrontation had first aired, reactions came fast, and they were far from uniform. The mainstream media struggled to categorize what had happened on that stage in Houston. Was it a theological debate, a political ambush, or was it, as one journalist put it, a mirror America wasn't ready to look into? On conservative Christian networks, hosts bristled. Some accused Ibrahim Traore of disrespecting a beloved figure. "It's easy to come from a war-torn nation and criticize what you don't understand," one pastor in Dallas said. Joel Osteen has built a ministry that gives people hope, but not all responses were defensive. In New York, a group of Black church leaders hosted a public forum titled "Truth in Theater: What Traore's Words Mean for Us?" One panelist, a veteran pastor from Harlem, put it plainly: "The brothers said what needed saying. We've wrapped Christ in capitalism and called it blessing. But when a man from the continent holds up a mirror, we call it an attack." Internationally, the moment sparked an even wider fire. In Brazil, theologians referenced Traore's speech in discussions about the rise of prosperity gospel across South America. In the UK, Christian newspapers featured headlines like, "African leader rebukes Western Christianity. Is he right?" In Kenya, street preachers quoted him word for word, "Hope without truth is deception. Positivity without accountability is poison." The Vatican did not comment directly, but unofficial statements from certain Catholic leaders noted that Traore's emphasis on justice and sacrifice echoed themes long championed by liberation theology. In secular spheres, particularly among younger African Americans, the speech became a viral reference point. Instagram Reels replayed Traore's most cutting lines. TikTok users stitched clips with commentary on wealth inequality and religious manipulation. One video featuring his quote, If Christ walked your city, would he recognize his church? Garnered over 10 million views in 48 hours. The political ramifications were harder to pin down. The U.S. government made no official statement, but internal sources confirmed that analysts at the State Department had flagged the event. Why? Because it represented something new, a spiritual confrontation with political undertones that bypassed diplomatic channels and went straight to the people. For decades, American soft power in Africa had flowed not just through aid and trade, but through churches, mission groups, and faith-based initiatives. Now the very ground of that influence had been shaken by a single televised exchange, and Traore, whether intentionally or not, had flipped the script. An African wasn't receiving the gospel, he was delivering the rebuke. Even in France, the former colonial power, a respected journalist noted, Traore's words mark a shift. Africa is no longer silent. It is no longer waiting to be saved. It is speaking, challenging, and reclaiming its moral ground. In one poignant op-ed from Al Jazeera, the writer concluded, "The West exported religion to Africa. Now Africa is returning it, not wrapped in comfort, but clothed in truth." Traore's message had crossed borders, not as an act of aggression, but as a call to conscience. And across nations, across denominations, across ideologies, the world was left asking, what if he's right? The ripples reached every continent, but the real storm was in our hearts. Long after the applause had faded and the studio lights dimmed, the message of Ibrahim Traore still echoed, not just in Houston, but in huts, churches, and city squares across the African continent. This was more than a confrontation. It was a crossroads. If Christianity was to survive, not merely as a religion, but as a transformative force, it had to return to its roots, not in Rome, not in Texas, but in sacrifice, in justice, in truth. And it was Africa, long dismissed as the passive recipient of the gospel, that now stood at the edge of leadership. Traore made this clear, not with arrogance, but with burden. He reminded the world of communities in Burkina Faso, where Christians and Muslims laid bricks side by side to build a school, not arguing over theology, but united by compassion. No televised sermon, no tithe-based blessing, just service, just dignity. If faith is not feeding the hungry, he had said, then what is it doing? The path ahead would not be easy. There would be resistance, from powerful ministries, from global donors, even from those within African churches who had grown too comfortable. But Traore had offered a blueprint, a vision where Africa would no longer mimic the Western megachurch, but instead offer a model rooted in community, struggle, and resilience. A church where elders are honored, not replaced by marketing directors. A pulpit where truth is preached, not repackaged for donors. A fellowship where sacrifice is celebrated, not avoided. This was the call to arms for African believers, not to attack the West, but to liberate their own vision of faith from Western entanglements. The question wasn't just theological, it was generational. Would the next generation of African Christians inherit a gospel built on stadiums and slogans? Or would they reclaim the gospel of sweat, soil, and shared bread? Traore had lit the fire, but it would be the people, young and old, who would decide whether it burns as a flame of change or fades into memory. And for Africa, the choice was clear: to follow the path of comfort or to lead the world by rediscovering the gospel's original power. Not in prosperity, but in purpose. As Traore had said that night, standing firm beneath the lights of Houston, the kingdom is not a marketplace. It is not a transaction. It is a transformation. This was not just a sermon. It was a call to arms of the Spirit. What began as a polite exchange between a pastor and a president became one of the most searing spiritual reckonings of the century. But in truth, it was never about just Joel Osteen, and it was never only about Ibrahim Traore. It was about us, about the kind of faith we've built and the kind we've forgotten, about a church that once stood with slaves and rebels, but now courts politicians and billionaires, about a gospel that once turned empires upside down, but now risks becoming their echo. Traore's voice on that stage didn't just criticize, it called. It called for a return, not to tradition but to truth, Not to comfort, but to conviction. Not to the past, but to a future where sacrifice is not weakness, but witness. From Burkina Faso to Baltimore, from Lagos to London, the message is the same. If faith is only about receiving, then it is not yet Christ's faith. If it fears justice, it does not know love. And if it avoids truth, it has lost its power. We now stand at a turning point. Not just the church, but the continent of Africa. The days of waiting for saviors from abroad are fading. The age of borrowed theology is ending. What rises next will be ours if we have the courage to build it. And so we ask you, elder, believer, truth seeker, if Christ returned today, would he recognize the faith in your heart? Would he see your courage in your community? Would he find his message in your actions, not just your prayers? Because the gospel, as Traore reminded the world, was never meant to be watched. It was meant to be lived. If this moment stirred your spirit, let it move your fingers. Like, share, and speak truth. Subscribe to Africa Rising Voice, because Ibrahim Traore just showed the world what Burkina Faso still remembers. The gospel is not for sale.